Hi, I'm Kate Delaney, Learning Lab Specialist here at Gwinnett County Public Library. Welcome to the T-Shirt Sew-Along. Today, I'm going to be walking you through the process of copying and recreating your favorite basic T-shirt. I'm going to be using this simple scoop neck tee to make my pattern, and you can follow along using whatever simple T-shirt you have at home that you want to recreate. Here are the supplies that we're going to be using today. First of all, you're going to need a T-shirt to make a copy of. I would recommend picking a fairly simple one that doesn't have any additional frills or pockets or anything like that. You're going to need some big paper. I'm using a roll of oak tag paper, which is similar to what manila folders are made out of. But if you don't have any of that lying around your house, you could use craft paper. You could use the backside of gift wrap. You could use parchment paper from your kitchen. Anything that's large enough for you to draw the pattern pieces on will work just fine. You need a ruler, some pins, a flexible measuring tape. Now this is important. You're going to need stretch needles for your sewing machine. We're not going to be using a serger today, although you certainly could. But in order to keep this simple for everybody who's staying at home and working on their home machines, we're just going to do it on the sewing machine, and it's very important that you use a ballpoint needle, also called a stretch needle, or possibly a jersey needle. Machine needles for knit fabrics have a rounder tip, and it's designed to go in between the layers of knit and elastic without breaking anything. If you use a typical sewing machine needle, it could create tiny holes in your fabric that will get bigger and bigger over time. For marking tools, I'm using pencils and chalk. The pencil is for my paper and the chalk is for my fabric. You can use whatever you have. Crayons work really well for fabric, or if you have fabric markers, that would work as well. Here is my knit jersey t-shirt fabric. This goes by a lot of different names at the fabric store. A lot of times you can find fabric that actually is called t-shirt fabric or jersey. Mine is cotton, but it's also often made of polyester or bamboo or a variety of different things. The easiest way to tell is just feel the fabric with your hands, and if it feels like it would make a good t-shirt, then go for it. You'll need some cutting tools. Here I've got my paper scissors, my fabric scissors, and a rotary cutter, and the big blue mat underneath is my cutting mat. This is optional. If you don't have a cutting mat and a rotary cutter, it's totally fine. You can simply cut out your pattern pieces with scissors, not a problem. You'll want matching thread. Here I'm using contrast thread so that it's easier for you to see what I'm doing in the video, but typically you would want a thread that matches your fabric. And then finally, I've got a couple of pieces of elastic, and we're going to insert those into the shoulder seams of the t-shirt to give it structure and make it last longer. The first step is to measure the neck band that goes around the neck opening of your shirt. Take a flexible tape measure. I like to start at one of the seams so I have a defined starting and ending point. And I am not stretching the fabric, but I am gently pulling it straight so that I can get as accurate a measurement as possible. So I get a neckband length of 34.5 inches. You may have more or less in your measurement. Don't worry if your number is not the same as mine. T-shirts have lots of different sizes of neck bands. This one is a pretty big scoop neck right here. I'm going to write down that measurement, 34.5, and I'm also going to measure the width of the neckband. Notice this piece of the t-shirt is usually doubled over, and that looks like about 1/2 inch, so I'm going to call it 1 inch, and this does not include any seam allowance yet. We're going to add that in later. Now that we have our neckband measurement, it's time to move on to creating the rest of our pattern pieces. First, we're going to do the front of the t-shirt. To do this, start by finding the center line that goes right down the middle front of the t-shirt from the center of the neckline to the center of the bottom hem. You can find it by matching up the side seams. And once you've found the center line of your t-shirt, lay it so that it aligns with the straight edge on the side of your paper. Smooth it out as good as you can. So mark the bottom hem all the way to the side seam. And I like to put a little notch right where the side seam comes out. And then I'm going to find points up the side seam, put my finger there, and then lift up the shirt and create a dot on my paper right next to my finger. So I'm basically creating a connect the dots line drawing of this front t-shirt pattern piece. I'm going to make a point where the top of that pattern piece is. And I'm going to find the intersection where the side seam meets the sleeve seam and create a dot right there. Now, if it's getting a little bit lumpy for you at this point, you can reconfigure your fabric and get all of that excess off to the side, because you've got a few points on your paper now to help you find exactly where your shirt should be laying. Be careful as you create the curve of the sleeve seam, and pay close attention to making it as uniform a curve as possible. Really, doing the curves are one of the hardest parts. If you have a French curve ruler, it can be really helpful in these situations to make very nice and neat pattern pieces. However, we're just doing it the old-fashioned way for this video. You want to stop your sleeve curve right where the shoulder seam is at the top, because remember, we're only doing the front pattern piece. And then you just go back and connect the dots. You can use your ruler to help out with the straight edges. As of right now, this pattern piece does not include any seam allowance. So we're going to go back in and draw a line all the way around that pattern piece we just created that's 1/2 inch outside of it, which will give us a 1/2 inch seam allowance as we sew. Now, we don't need to add the seam allowance to the center line, but for the shoulder seam, the side seam, the neck, the sleeve, and the bottom hem, we're going to add an extra 1/2 inch. And it comes in really handy if you have a transparent ruler. But if not, do your best. If it ends up being, you know, a little less or a little more than 1/2 inch, it's totally fine. It's not going to ruin your t-shirt. That's one of the beautiful things about sewing with knits, is they are extremely forgiving. Once you're done adding in the seam allowance, cut out the whole pattern piece along the outer line. And I always like to write on the pattern piece what it is, so that when I'm digging through my drawer of pattern pieces later, it's easy for me to identify. Now we're going to do the back of the t-shirt in exactly the same way that we did the front. So start out by finding the center line that goes from the center of the back neckband all the way to the bottom hem, and line up the center back with the straight edge of your paper. Go ahead and mark the bottom and the top of your pattern piece, and then just create your dotted line all the way around, exactly the same way that you did with the front. Remember not to include the neckband in your measurement. We've got a separate piece for that, so lift it up just a little bit. And if the back of your sleeve seam seems to be a different curve than the front, don't worry about it. This is very common. You'll just need to keep in mind when you make your sleeve pattern which is the front of the sleeve and which is the back. So go ahead and connect the dots to make your pattern piece. It's okay if you don't have a perfectly smooth curve. Since I don't have a French curve, I'm just making short line segments that kind of come together to make more of a geometric curve, and that's absolutely fine for this. And once you've got your piece completely outlined, remember to go back in and put in your 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around the outside. And once you've got that done, you can cut out your piece and move on to the sleeve. Now we're going to do our final pattern piece, the sleeve. The sleeve can be tricky because we're actually going to have to flip our shirt over in the middle. We're going to do the front first. So start by finding the intersection of seams in the armpit. That's going to be our reference point. Lay your shirt as flat as possible and create a line that represents the seam that goes down the sleeve under your arm. Now, using the same connect the dots method that we used creating the other pattern pieces, follow the curve of the sleeve seam up towards the shoulder, creating dots every inch or so until you get to the shoulder seam. Once you get to the shoulder seam, pick up your shirt and flip it so that you can see the back of the sleeve. Line it up so that the curve of that sleeve seam is just going to continue right along the same way that it did. And continue making your dotted lines. You want to mark where the armpit seam is on the opposite side. And at this point, you can decide how long you want your sleeve to be. The sleeve on the shirt that I'm working from is pretty long. It's a 3/4 length shirt, but I want to make an actual t-shirt that has short sleeves. And I want it to have kind of longish short sleeves, so I'm going to go with about 5 or 6 inches. But you could do a cap sleeve that's just 2 or 3 inches. You could do exactly what your existing t-shirt is. This is an easy place to be creative and make the sleeve however you like it. Once you're done transferring the shape of the pattern piece onto your paper, trace out your line and add your seam allowance all the way around. And you may also want to mark which side of the pattern piece is the front of the sleeve and which side is the back, in case yours was different. So now that we have our pattern pieces cut out, we need to transfer those patterns onto our fabric. I've got this knit cotton that I've pre-washed and ironed, so if you haven't done those steps with your fabric yet, pause the video, wash and dry your fabric, and then press it nice and flat, and then rejoin me. So I'm aligning the center back along this folded edge of my fabric. And if you want, you can take a piece of chalk or a fabric marker and trace onto your fabric. I have one of these rotary cutters, so I'm just going to be cutting directly into the fabric while holding down my pattern piece to make sure it doesn't move around. Okay, there's the back. I'm going to set that aside and cut out the rest of my pieces. The front pattern piece wants to keep curling up, so I'm weighing it down with these washers. You don't have to buy special pattern weights. You can use whatever you have lying around. Okay, here's the front piece. I think that's going to make a really cute t-shirt. We need the sleeves next. Okay, we've got 2 sleeve pieces. Now the last thing we need is to cut out the neckband. We didn't make a pattern for it, but we do know the measurements of what that piece is supposed to be. The neckband on my t-shirt is 34.5 inches by 1 inch, and that is not including a seam allowance. So I'm going to add an inch to each of those measurements and cut out a really long skinny rectangle that is 35.5 inches long and 2 inches wide. Let's talk about the sewing machine settings for a minute. Choosing the right stitch for knit fabrics is very important. Most machines have at least one, usually several more, elastic stitches. The one that I'm going to be using is number 15 on my machine, and it looks like 3 vertical lines in a row. And what that stitch icon is telling me is that the needle is going to go forward a stitch, back, and then forward again, which puts a zigzag into a stitch that ends up looking like a straight stitch on your garment. This is also a very strong zigzag stitch, which is good for knitwear because it's going to be having a lot of pressure on the seams at times. So I'm going to go ahead and select that stitch. If your machine does not have a triple zigzag stitch like this, you can certainly use whatever zigzag stitch you have. It might be a simple zigzag like this one. It might be more of a lightning bolt stitch like this. Any of these stitches will work. Another important factor when sewing with knits is setting the length and width of your zigzag stitch. So for mine, because the stitch that I'm going to be using doesn't actually have a side-to-side component, it merely goes back and forth in a straight line, I'm going to keep my stitch width set to 0. My stitch length will be 2.5. However, if you're using a traditional zigzag stitch like this one, you will need to set the stitch width as well. I would suggest starting with a width between 2.5 and 3. Experiment on a scrap of fabric and see if this is sufficient in holding your piece. If it seems like it's not strong enough, lower the numbers on both the length and the width to get a tighter stitch. And feel free to experiment as many times as you need to determine the stitch length and width that works best for your fabric. Now that we have our pattern pieces all cut out, the first step is to attach the front with the back at the shoulder seams. If you're using a fabric that has an obvious right side and wrong side, you want to make sure you're putting the right sides towards the inside, right sides together, touching. But mine is reversible, so it doesn't really matter. I'm not too worried about it. Okay, so we have our front and back pinned together at the shoulders. That's the first step. Now it's time to use the elastic. It's common in knitwear to put elastic along seams that are going to have a particularly large amount of stress on them. For tops, this is usually the shoulder seam. So we're just going to pin this in place right in the middle. If you remember where our seam is going to be, it's 1/2 inch in from this raw edge. So we're just going to pin this so that when we sew that seam, we're going to be sewing right on top of this piece of elastic. And there we have it. There's 3 layers on each shoulder seam, 2 layers of jersey, and the piece of elastic. So I'm just going to put this onto the machine with the elastic on top so I can see where it is. I'm going to align it with my 1/2 inch markings on my machine. and lower the foot to hold it in place. Now before I lower the needle, I'm going to double check my machine settings. I'm on my zigzag stitch. The one I'm using requires a width of 0, and I'm going to do a length of 2.5. So it looks good. Time to get started sewing. Now I'm going to trim off the excess elastic on each side. The next step is going to be sewing the neckline. So what we're going to do is we're going to pin the short ends together. Again, if you're using a fabric that has a right side and a wrong side, you're doing this right sides together, right sides facing. And stitch these together right along here. Okay, and I think I'm probably going to trim off a little bit of these raw edges so there's not a bulky spot inside the collar right there. But I want to be very careful not to cut this line of stitching when I do that. The next step is to fold it lengthwise with the wrong sides together, just like this. And I'm going to take it over to my iron and press a crease along this edge. It's going to make it much easier to sew this onto the t-shirt if I have a crease pressed into it. Now that I've got my neckband pressed with the wrong sides together, that means your raw seam is going to be on the inside, it's time to pin the neckband to the neckline of the shirt with the right sides together. I'm going to start by finding the center back of the shirt, and I'm going to put the seam of my neckband in the center back. And it's right sides together, so this neckband is going to go along the outside, and all of those raw edges should be aligning. So I've got the raw edge of the back of the shirt and the 2 raw edges of the neckband. And I'm going to pin those together. The next thing I'm going to do is find the center front of the shirt. And I'm also going to find the center front of the neckband, being careful not to let it get twisted. And I'm going to match those points up together and pin them. Now I'm going to find the center of each of these sides and pin those. So I'm pinning the neckline in a very methodical way to make sure that the neckband is evenly distributed along the neckline of the t-shirt. I'm going to continue pinning around the neckband. For each new pin, I'm going to the middle of whatever open section I can find. That looks pretty good to me. The next step is to sew all around the neckband 1/2 inch from the raw edge. So now our neckline is installed. Take your garment over to the ironing board and press it into the correct position so that it sits nicely the way that it's supposed to. Now that we've pressed our necklines so that the seam allowance is pointed down to the interior of the shirt and the outside looks like this, it's time to stitch around the neckband again. This time we're going to be doing top stitching. So what it's going to do is it's going to hold the seam allowance in place on the interior of the shirt, and it's also going to create an extra line of stitching around the neck. Now I'm using a contrast thread for mine. You could use a matching thread or a contrast thread. It's totally your choice. Whenever I use a contrast thread, I like to use an edge stitching foot on the machine. This is optional. You can totally use your standard sewing machine foot. But for me, I find that using an edge stitching foot helps make the line of top stitching extremely straight and smooth without any wavy parts. And that's a look that I'm going for if I'm going to be doing a contrast thread top stitching. So I'm just going to switch out the feet on my machine. And this time we won't be looking at the 1/2 inch seam allowance. We are just going to be sewing this line of stitching on the main t-shirt side of the neckband. So here's the neckband and here's the main part of the t-shirt. And if you look at it from the inside, we're going to be stitching right on top of this seam allowance, just underneath our original line of stitching. The next step is pinning and attaching the sleeves to the t-shirt. Lay your front and back flat out on a surface with the right side facing up. Take one of your sleeves and match the center point of your sleeve with the center point of this curve. If on your t-shirt, 1/2 of your curve is slightly taller than the other, you can see that this half of the sleeve has a lower arch than this half. The higher side typically goes in the back. That's got a little bit of extra room for the shoulder area in it. There's one sleeve. If it's a little bit wavy along the edge, don't worry about it. That almost always happens when you're creating a 3-dimensional garment out of 2-dimensional fabric. These edges that have a lot of shape to them, like the shoulder, will often buckle a little bit. That's why we use lots of pins to make sure that we can get our seam as flat as possible. Now that we're done pinning, let's take this back over to the sewing machine. We're going to stitch each sleeve along that raw edge using our 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we need to close up the side and the underarm of the shirt. So pin together this long seam. I've got the end of my shirt sleeve. You want to match up seams in the armpit and pin together the length of the front and the back all the way down the side to the bottom hem. And of course we're doing this wrong sides together. And when you're at the seams, you want to make sure that they're pointing down the sleeve, not to the interior of the shirt. And I'm just going to put a pin right on the seam allowances to make sure that they stay pointing the way that I want them to, even when I'm sewing them. Now I'm going to sew all the way down using my 1/2 inch seam allowance. When I get to the seam, I'm going to pause for a moment and peek underneath to make sure that my seams are still pointing the way that I want them to. And they are, so I'm going to remove the pin while holding them down and sew right over that seam. And now I'm going to do the other side. Okay, we're almost done. If you want to flip it right side out and take a look at it, it should look like an actual t-shirt now that you can try on. And voila, a t-shirt it is. The final step is going to be hemming the sleeves and the bottom hem. I've got my shirt inside out, and for the sleeve hems and the bottom hem, I'm going to fold the edge to the inside by about 1/2 inch. And this can get tricky with some knits like mine. You can see it really wants to roll up, and that can kind of be deceiving in how much you've actually turned the hem. So keep an eye on that, don't let it roll too much. And then just stitch a line all the way around. If you want, you can pin this. For the sleeves in particular, I feel like keeping it wrapped pretty taut around the arm of the sewing machine is enough to keep my fold in place, but if you don't feel like it's enough, by all means you can pin. And time for the last step, the hem. I'm going to pin this into place. It's too big, I don't trust myself to eyeball it. So I'm going to start pinning the way I always do, from the edges, the side seams, the center front, and the center back. And voila, here we have it. A finished t-shirt. Give it one final press to make the seams a bit more crisp, and you're ready to wear it. Thank you so much for joining me for the t-shirt sew along. Here's the finished product. I think it looks great. I would love to see the shirts that you made. Please post a picture of your creations to our social media. We would love to connect with you. And if you've got any ideas for future tutorials, don't hesitate to let us know. I'm Kate with the Learning Labs. Thanks again. Have a great day.